detective who led the murder investigation, and the conviction for fraud of the juvenile officer who had first suggested Eccles, Spaulding, and Miss Kelly as possible killers. To my knowledge, the Arkansas Times is the only paper that has editorialized on behalf of new trials for the men. By contrast, very little about the case has appeared in our own statewide daily, the Arkansas Democrat-Gazette. The one columnist there who did write about it voiced, unwittingly I'm sure, exactly the attitude that until recently has prevailed in my state and at that paper. In 2001, Philip Martin, the paper's chief writer on cultural affairs, noted the support that was building nationally and even internationally for the three inmates, including that from musicians and what he called Hollywood types. Martin wrote that he realized that many of the West Memphis Three's supporters were, quote, well-meaning and sincere, and that reasonable, decent people can disagree. Still, he wrote that he believed that Eccles, Baldwin, and Miss Kelly were guilty. Martin went to lengths to acknowledge the supporters' concerns. He said that, like them, he had not been convinced of the defendant's guilt beyond a reasonable doubt, that he too had harbored some misgivings about the way the police identified the suspect, and he'd been troubled by the satanic hysteria surrounding this case. And he realized that the West Memphis trials were messy and largely circumstantial. He acknowledged that confessions can be false, that Jesse's confession was hardly convincing, that the teenager probably had an extremely low IQ, that he disliked the state's insistence on dragging a self-styled expert on satanic rituals into Eccles and Baldwin's trials, that police routinely cut corners, that there are innocent, or at least not guilty, people in our prisons, and that if you are poor and friendless, you are treated differently than if you are wealthy and well-connected. He said he knew that the Arkansas judicial system was, quote, capable of atrocity, and that it was, quote, probably incapable of convicting and even executing the wrong person. Nevertheless, Martin wrote, 2 juries had found the defendants guilty, and he had seen no convincing evidence that those verdicts were wrong. He wrote, it makes a good story. Yokel cops crucify the misfit. It could sell some books, but it ignores the facts. And this raises an aspect of media that we perhaps never consider enough. The grapevine. It is so close to the ground, so unorganized, and so familiar that we hardly see it. But in Arkansas, with regard to this case, word of mouth, rumor, has always prevailed over what was or was not professionally reported about the trials. In Martin's case, he did not cite what facts he believed had been ignored. Rather, he explained that all his doubts had been laid to rest by what he called, quote, a couple of back-channel conversations, a couple of back-channel conversations. Without divulging his sources, or saying what in those conversations he found so persuasive, Martin assured his readers, their word was good enough for me. The cops had the right guys. But he didn't even stop there. While granting that he wouldn't mind too much if Eccles, Baldwin, and Miss Kelly somehow managed to get new trials, Martin wrote that he didn't much care if their case was never reviewed. While I'm opposed to capital punishment, he wrote, I don't think Damien Eccles has a particularly good argument against it. I could be wrong, but he seems thoroughly calculating and cynical about all this. He seems to be enjoying the attention. He seems evil, which I imagine some of his supporters would argue is what got him into all this trouble in the first place. Eccles seems evil. I personally like Philip Martin, but I find that a despicable piece of writing. Even so, I don't mind telling you that it nailed the sense of the times. Awareness was growing that the case was riddled with problems, that the trials were far less than what they ought to have been. But like many in Arkansas, Martin was able to acknowledge all of that intellectually, and at the same time also pronounced that certain information which they could not reveal and which had never appeared in court, it convinced them that the three were guilty. As Martin had written, the cops had the right guys. I cannot tell you how many times I heard that line of thought repeated. If that is so, I would ask, why do you think the prosecutors did not present this damning information at the trials? There was never a good answer. Instead, I heard responses that again echoed Martin. Well, whatever happened, you can just look at Damien Nichols and tell he's evil. So what is a girl to do? When reporters from papers such as the New York Times came to Arkansas to explore the growing support for the three convicted killers, West Memphis police and other state officials had a ready, easy answer. Those supporters, they said, they mean well, but they were uninformed. They were not from Arkansas, and they didn't know what really happened. After a while, I had enough of that. I am an Arkansan, I do know the facts, and I am a citizen. In my roles as a journalist and a citizen, I concluded that I had an obligation to speak out against trials that I, along with much of the world, had come to view as travesties. I became an advocate. My paper, the Arkansas Times, was fine with that, and so apparently were my readers. Now, in addition to relating the facts of the case at every venue to which I was invited, I began to also offer my opinion. Arkansas should give these men fair trials, or Arkansas should set them free. A columnist in, of all places, the Arkansas Democrat-Gazette, has criticized me for abandoning my objectivity. But I am not much bothered. For one thing, I believe in fairness, but not objectivity. I believe that some of our country's greatest journalists have opposed government abuses and stood for human rights. I do not believe that